Imagine being punished just for being poor, not breaking the law, not hurting anyone, but simply because they're struggling to survive. That's exactly what's happening in America today, and it's not an accident, it's a strategy. You've heard the slogans, Make America Great Again, Drain the Swamp, Put America First. But behind the catchy phrases and red hats, a much darker story was unfolding, one that targeted the most vulnerable people in the country. During the Trump years, poverty wasn't just ignored, it was weaponized. Instead of helping people get back on their feet, the government made it even harder for millions of Americans who were already living on the edge. Programs that had once been a lifeline, food stamps, housing assistance, Medicaid, were slashed or saddled with impossible requirements. If you couldn't prove you were working enough hours, even if you were sick, disabled, or caring for a loved one, you risked losing everything. No income, no health care, no safety net. And while the poorest Americans were being demonized, the wealthiest were cashing in. Massive tax cuts for billionaires and corporations were passed with lightning speed. The message couldn't have been clearer. If you're rich, you get a reward. If you're poor, you get a boot to the neck. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't new. This mindset, blaming the poor for their poverty, has deep roots in American history. Politicians have long used poverty as a political weapon, crafting a narrative that says if you're struggling, it's your fault. You're lazy, you're irresponsible, you're undeserving of help. And under Trump, the narrative went into overdrive. Suddenly, words like welfare queen and moochers weren't just whispered in dark corners, they were blasted from the White House podium. Policies were crafted not to lift people up, but to kick them down harder. It wasn't about saving money. Many of these cuts actually cost more in the long run. It was about sending a message. Poor people are the enemy. Meanwhile, the reality on the ground was devastating. Mothers working two jobs still couldn't afford enough food to feed their children. Seniors were rationing insulin because their Medicare benefits were gutted. Families were evicted in the middle of a pandemic because eviction moratoriums were allowed to expire without backup plans. And when poor people dared to organize, to protest, to demand dignity, they were met with scorn or silence. Movements like the Poor People's Campaign, revival efforts that spoke truth to power, were largely ignored by mainstream media. Why? Because it's easier to shame the poor than to listen to them. It's easier to say they just need to work harder than to admit that the system is rigged against them from the start. Here's the brutal truth. Poverty in America isn't an accident, it's a policy choice. We have more than enough resources to ensure every American has food, shelter, healthcare, and education, but those in power choose to prioritize billionaires over babies, corporations over communities, and profit over people. And the cruelty isn't a side effect, it's the point. By keeping people desperate, you keep them divided. By blaming the poor, you distract everyone from the real source of the problem, the unchecked greed of the ultra-wealthy and the politicians who serve them. The fight against poverty should be one of the easiest moral calls we could ever make. Helping people survive shouldn't be controversial. Giving children a chance shouldn't spark debate. But in Trump's America, cruelty became a badge of honor. Policies were celebrated not for who they helped, but for who they hurt. Work requirements for benefits are back in the national conversation. Cuts to food programs and Medicaid are still looming, and the myth that poor people are somehow the problem continues to poison our politics. But it doesn't have to be this way. Across the country, ordinary people are fighting back. Low-wage workers are organizing. Communities are building solidarity networks. Faith leaders are resurrecting the moral call to end poverty and lift up the oppressed. Real change has never started at the top. It's always been driven by those who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable, by those who dare to imagine a country where dignity isn't reserved for the rich. Ending poverty isn't just about charity, it's about justice. It's about recognizing that every human deserves the basics of life simply because they're human. It's about understanding that poverty is not a personal failure, it's a systematic one. And it's about rejecting the politics built on cruelty and fear and choosing the one rooted in compassion and courage instead. So the next time you hear a politician talking about entitlement reform or cracking down on welfare, ask yourself, who does this policy really serve? Who benefits from keeping millions of people one paycheck away from disaster? And most importantly, what kind of country do we want to be? A nation that punishes its poor or one that lifts them up? The choice is ours.